Near a big forest, there lived a poor woodcutter with his wife and their 2 kids. The boy's name was Hansel, and the girl's name was Gretel. They didn't have much to eat, and when a terrible famine hit the land, the woodcutter couldn't afford to buy food anymore. One night, while he was lying in bed, unable to sleep because of his worries, he sighed and said to his wife, "What's going to happen to us? How can we feed our poor children when we don't even have enough for ourselves?" His wife replied, "Listen, I've got an idea. Tomorrow morning, we'll take the kids deep into the forest where it's really dense. We'll make a fire for them, give each of them a piece of bread, and then leave them there while we go to work. They won't be able to find their way back home, and we'll be free of them." The man was shocked. "No, wife," he said, "I can't do that. How could I leave my children alone in the forest? Wild animals would come and tear them apart." "You fool," she snapped. "If we don't do this, all 4 of us will starve to death. You might as well start building our coffins now." She kept nagging him until he finally gave in. But even then, the man said, "I feel so sorry for the poor children." Hansel and Gretel couldn't sleep either because they were so hungry, and they overheard their stepmother's plan. While she was talking to their father, Gretel started crying and said to Hansel, "This is the end for us. We're doomed." Hansel tried to calm her down. "Don't worry, Gretel," he said. "I'll figure something out to help us." Once their parents had fallen asleep, Hansel quietly got out of bed, put on his little coat, and sneaked outside. The moon was shining brightly, and the white pebbles in front of the house sparkled like shiny silver coins. Hansel bent down and filled his pockets with as many pebbles as he could carry. Then he went back inside and whispered to Gretel, "Don't worry, little sister. Try to sleep now. Everything will be okay." Then he climbed back into bed. Early the next morning, before the sun was up, their stepmother came and woke them. "Get up, you lazy kids. We're going into the forest to gather wood." She gave each of them a tiny piece of bread and said, "Here's your lunch, but don't eat it all at once, because that's all you're getting." Gretel hid the bread under her apron, while Hansel kept the pebbles hidden in his pocket. The family set off towards the forest. As they walked, Hansel kept slowing down and turning to look back at the house. He did this over and over until his father finally noticed. "Hansel, why are you lagging behind and looking back all the time? Keep up with us and pay attention to where you're going." Hansel quickly replied, "Oh, I was just looking at my little white cat sitting on the roof. It wants to say goodbye to me." His stepmother scoffed. "What nonsense! That's not a cat. It's just the sunlight reflecting off the chimney." But Hansel wasn't looking at a cat at all. Every time he turned around, he secretly dropped one of the shiny white pebbles from his pocket onto the ground. When they reached the middle of the forest, Their father said, "All right, kids, gather some wood so I can make a fire to keep you warm." Hansel and Gretel worked together, piling up sticks and branches until they had a small hill of wood. Their father lit the fire, and soon the flames were blazing high. Then their stepmother said, "Now, kids, lie down by the fire and rest. We're going deeper into the forest to cut wood. When we're done, we'll come back and get you." Hansel and Gretel stayed by the fire, warming themselves. Around noon, they each ate their small piece of bread. They could still hear the sound of chopping wood and thought their father was nearby. But it wasn't the axe at all. He had tied a branch to a dead tree, and the wind was making it knock back and forth, sounding like chopping. The children sat by the fire for a long time, and eventually they were so tired that they fell asleep. When they finally woke up, it was already nighttime, and everything was dark. Gretel started to cry. "How are we supposed to get out of the forest now?" she sobbed. Hansel tried to cheer her up. "Don't worry," he said. "Just wait a little while for the moon to rise. Once it's up, we'll be able to find our way." When the full moon finally rose, its light made the pebbles shine like silver coins. Taking Gretel's hand, Hansel led the way, following the trail of glowing stones. They walked all night long, and just as the sun was rising, they finally arrived back at their father's house. They knocked on the door, and when their stepmother opened it and saw them, she said, "You naughty children! Why did you stay in the forest so long? We thought you were never coming back." But their father was overjoyed to see them. Leaving them behind in the forest had broken his heart, and he was relieved. They were home again. Not long after their first trip into the forest, there was another terrible famine, and food ran out again. One night, Hansel and Gretel overheard their stepmother talking to their father. "Everything's gone. We only have half a loaf of bread left, and when that's gone, we'll starve. The kids have to go. This time, we'll take them even deeper into the forest, so they can't find their way back. It's the only way we can survive." The father's heart felt heavy. He thought it would be better to share our last bite of food with the children. But his wife wouldn't listen. She nagged and scolded him until he gave in again, just like before. The children were awake and heard everything. When their parents went to sleep, Hansel quietly got up to gather pebbles, like he had done the first time. But this time, the stepmother had locked the door, and he couldn't get outside. Even though he was worried, he whispered to Gretel, "Don't cry, Gretel. Go to sleep." Early the next morning, their stepmother came and woke them up. She handed them their bread, but this time the pieces were even smaller than before. On the way into the forest, Hansel crumbled his bread in his pocket and kept stopping to drop little bits on the ground. "Hansel, why do you keep stopping and looking back?" his father asked. Hurry up and stay with us." "I'm looking at my little pigeon sitting on the roof. It wants to say goodbye to me," Hansel replied. "What nonsense!" snapped the stepmother. "That's not a pigeon. It's just the morning sun shining on the chimney." But Hansel didn't care what she said. He kept dropping crumbs along the path, little by little, hoping they would lead him and Gretel back home. This time, their stepmother took them even deeper into the forest, to a place they'd never been before. Once again, they built a fire, and she said, "Sit here by the fire and rest. When you're tired, you can sleep a bit. We'll go cut wood, and we'll come back for you in the evening." When noon came, Gretel shared her bread with Hansel, since he had scattered his along the path. They sat by the fire until they got sleepy, and eventually fell asleep. Evening came and went, but no one came back for them. When they woke up, it was dark. Gretel began to worry, but Hansel comforted her. "Don't be scared," he said. "Just wait until the moon rises. The crumbs I left on the ground will show us the way home." When the moon came up, the two started following the path, but when they looked for the crumbs, they couldn't find them. Every single one had been eaten by the birds in the forest. Hansel tried to stay positive. "Don't worry, Gretel, we'll find our way." But they didn't. They wandered through the forest all night and all the next day, from morning until evening, but they couldn't find their way out. They were starving, with nothing to eat except a few berries they found on the ground. They were so tired that their legs couldn't carry them anymore, so they lay down under a tree and fell asleep. It had been 3 days since Hansel and Gretel had left their father's house. They kept walking, but instead of finding their way out, they just went deeper and deeper into the forest. They were starving, exhausted, and losing hope. If help didn't come soon, they feared they wouldn't survive. Around noon, they spotted a beautiful snow-white bird sitting on a tree branch. It sang such a lovely song that they stopped to listen. When the bird finished, it spread its wings and flew ahead of them. Hansel and Gretel decided to follow it. After a while, the bird landed on the roof of a little house. When the children got closer, they couldn't believe their eyes. The house was made of bread. The roof was covered with cakes, and the windows were made of clear sugar. Hansel's face lit up. "Look at this. Let's have a feast. I'll eat some of the roof, and you can try the windows. They look so sweet." Hansel reached up and broke off a piece of the roof to taste it, while Gretel leaned against the window and nibbled at the sugary panes. Suddenly, a voice called out from inside the house, "Who's nibbling at my little house?" The children froze for a moment, but then answered, "It's the wind, the wind, just the heavenly wind." And they went right back to eating. Hansel thought the roof tasted amazing, so he tore off a big chunk. Gretel pushed out an entire round pane of sugar, sat down, and munched on it happily. Out of nowhere, the door creaked open, and out came a very old woman leaning on crutches. She looked so frail and kind that Hansel and Gretel were startled and dropped the food they were holding. The old woman smiled and said, "Oh, my dear children, who brought you here? Come inside and stay with me. I'll take good care of you. Don't be afraid." She took their hands and led them into the house. Inside, she served them delicious food: milk, pancakes with sugar, apples, and nuts. After eating, she showed them 2 cozy little beds made with clean white sheets. Hansel and Gretel felt like they were in heaven. But the old woman wasn't as sweet as she seemed. She was actually a wicked witch who used her candy house to lure children. Once they were inside, she would capture, cook, and eat them. This was her idea of a feast day. Witches have red eyes and can't see very far, but their sense of smell is as sharp as a wild animal's. When Hansel and Gretel had wandered near her house, she had sniffed them out immediately. She laughed to herself and muttered, "Got them! They'll never escape now." Early the next morning, before the kids woke up, the witch was already up and scheming. She crept over to their beds and saw them sleeping peacefully, their cheeks rosy and plump. Rubbing her hands together, she whispered, "They'll make a perfect little meal." She grabbed Hansel with her bony hands and carried him to a small cage outside, locking him in with a heavy grate. No matter how much Hansel screamed, it didn't help. Then she went back to Gretel, shook her awake, and barked, "Get up, you lazy girl! Go fetch some water and cook something tasty for your brother. He's in the stable, and I'm going to fatten him up. Once he's nice and plump, I'll eat him." Gretel burst into tears, crying bitterly, but it didn't matter. The witch forced her to do as she was told. The witch gave Hansel the best food every day, trying to fatten him up, but poor Gretel got nothing but scraps, just crab shells. Every morning, the old woman shuffled over to Hansel's cage and said, "Hansel, stick out your finger so I can check if you're getting plump enough." But Hansel was clever. Instead of his finger, he poked out a little bone he had found. The witch's eyesight wasn't great, so she thought it was his finger. She kept wondering why he wasn't getting any fatter, no matter how much she fed him. After 4 weeks of this, the witch got tired of waiting. She was so impatient that she finally said, "Gretel, get moving and bring me some water. Fat or skinny, I'm cooking Hansel tomorrow." Gretel cried as she went to fetch the water. Tears ran down her cheeks as she whispered, "If only wild animals had eaten us in the forest, at least we'd have died together." The witch snapped, "Stop that crying. It's no use, so just get on with it." Early the next morning, the witch made Gretel light a fire and hang a big pot of water over it. "We'll bake some bread first," the old woman said. "The oven is already hot, and the dough is ready." She then led Gretel to the oven, where flames were already roaring inside. "Crawl in," said the witch, "and check if it's hot enough for baking. Then we'll put the bread in." But Gretel wasn't fool. She knew exactly what the witch was planning. If she got inside, the witch would slam the door shut and bake her alive. So Gretel pretended to be confused. "I don't know how to do it," she said. "How do I get in there?" "You silly girl," snapped the witch. "It's big enough even for me. Look, I'll show you how." The witch leaned forward and stuck her head into the oven. Quick as lightning, Gretel shoved her inside and slammed the iron door shut. She bolted it, trapping the witch inside. The witch screamed and howled in pain, but Gretel didn't stay to listen. The wicked woman was burned alive. Gretel ran straight to Hansel's cage, threw open the door, and shouted, "Hansel, we're free! The witch is gone." Hansel jumped out of the cage like a bird escaping from its prison. They hugged each other tightly, laughing, crying, and dancing with joy. Now that they didn't have to fear the witch anymore, they went inside her house. To their surprise, they found chests in every corner filled with pearls and jewels. "These are way better than pebbles," Hansel said, stuffing his pockets full. Gretel grabbed some for herself, filling her apron with as many jewels as she could carry. "Let's get out of here," she said. After walking for a couple of hours, they reached a wide body of water. Hansel frowned. "We can't cross this," he said. "There's no bridge or walkway." "And no boat either," Gretel added. "But look, there's a white duck swimming over there. Maybe she can help us." Gretel called out, "No bridge, no boat to help us through. Please take us across on your back so true." The duck swam over to them. Hansel climbed onto her back and told Gretel to join him. But Gretel shook her head. "No, that'll be too heavy for her. Let her take us one at a time." The kind little duck agreed. She carried Hansel across first, then came back for Gretel. Once they were safely on the other side, they started walking again. Soon, the forest began to look familiar. They recognized trees and paths, and before long, they saw their father's house in the distance. Overjoyed, they ran as fast as they could, burst through the door, and threw themselves into their father's arms. Their father had been miserable ever since he left them in the forest, and he was overwhelmed with happiness to see them again. Their stepmother, however, had passed away. Gretel emptied her apron, and pearls and jewels spilled all over the floor. Hansel reached into his pockets and added handfuls of treasure. From that moment on, they had nothing to worry about. The little family lived together in peace and happiness.